Good morning. Those of you in the back there standing and watching, there's plenty of seats around, so come in and sit down. We've got a lot of material to cover. I don't think you want to stand at HIMSS any more than you have to. My name is David McCauley. I'm a Senior Vice President at Cerner, and I'm going to moderate and then participate in a little panel discussion with two of my colleagues. We're going to do a bit of an overview of what's going on in the industry around interoperability. We're going to dive in a little bit initially with my colleague from Cerner, Kashif Rathore, who's going to talk about what Cerner's doing to advance interoperability, mention a little bit about what's going on with the DoD and VA. Then Jitin Asnani, the Executive Director of Commonwealth, is going to give us an update on Commonwealth's progress, talk a little bit about the Commonwealth Care Quality relationship, and talk a little bit about what we think is coming with TEFCA from ONC. And then I'll come back up at the end and kind of zoom out and talk a little bit about broader trends in interoperability, mentioning things like what's happening with APIs and how's that going to affect the interoperability landscape going forward. So we've got a lot of topics to cover. We're going to go through these slides pretty quickly. Anything that you don't catch, feel free to talk to us afterwards and we can make sure you get a copy of the slides in some detail. So let me start by handing it over to Kashif.
Thank you, David.
There's your clicker.
Good morning, guys. My name is Kashif Rathore. I hear myself really loud. I'm an executive in Cerner who actually runs the interoperability services and strategy. I'm going to walk you through generally high-level things on the state of interoperability as it pertains to Cerner, and then how are we going to help the industry-wide connectivity for some of our Department of Defense and most likely Veterans Affairs departments, and how does that connect with the community. So we'll walk through some of those quickly. Then I'll hand over the microphone to Jitin Asnani, who would give us an update on the Commonwealth, and then back to David McCauley. So real quick, I wanted to make sure that from Cerner's standpoint, the commitment to interoperability is actually solid. That is one of the most important corporate imperatives. I know some of you care to hear, but some of you probably it's irrelevant. There's a lot of interoperability solutions and services that we provide, and I just wanted to give you a recap of certain things we're doing. I mean, if you start talking numbers type of stuff, we process around 536 million transactions a month back and forth for our client needs. And this is mostly to just give you an idea on that a lot of the state of interoperability as exists today is in a very good shape. However, there's more work that we need to do to continue to connect and provide services to the industry as the needs grow. So currently we're connected to 275 different disparate sources. Those are non-Cerner systems, anybody else. Most of our connections, 80% of them are with other partners in the industry, not within ourselves. That's a very, I think, important stat to remember. We provide HIEs as well, not just the EHR interoperability, but also utilities that can help interoperate. And that we offer around 160 different platforms, different clients all around the world. And direct, as you know, is a key meaningful use criteria. We're around 506,000 providers in around 1,600 facilities that we're supporting as of today. So interoperability to us is actually getting and making sure that patient's information, right information, is at the right time delivered to the right venue. And that's where it's meaningful. That is what we consider and what we define as seamless care connectivity to the community for our veterans and service members, and as well as the commercial segment for all patients. So just to give you a sort of a view of what we are going to be getting into on a journey here very soon as we have our Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs clients that start to embark on this journey. As the industry, and I know there's still some work there to solidify that statement, but in a state, if we have Department of Defense and the Veterans Affairs connecting to the community. This is kind of what the map looks like. This is the need for the facilities across our service teams that would want us to connect to the commercial segment. So this could, as in the next 5-10 years, when you're connecting to multiple private facilities, this map could just totally be blue and red, just designating what the needs are and what the expectation is. So you probably hear a lot about seamless care with the community. The expectation is that for servicemen and for the veterans, the information can be shared with the community providers, and we expect that community providers to be also able to get that information on the veteran and the Department of Active Duty members nationwide. So I think it's important to recognize the depth of the ask and the expectation that we're up against, not just me as Cerner, but I think all of us in the industry, because all of our venues will be at some point asked to connect to this map, as I showed previously. So the thought process is that, and the expectation is, that we have to have network of networks. We are expected to connect with Commonwealth. We are expected to connect with via the Care Quality Governance Board, the eHealth Exchange, Direct Trust, SureScripts, and any other networks. As we know, TEFCA in some of those definitions, and I know David will probably touch upon those, but as the industry shifts and the evolution occurs, we will be expected to ensure that we're connecting with all parties. So I would say it's a happy medium, happy go big family. That's what the expectation is at the end. A part of this is also an expectation that we will provide an open ecosystem that lets innovation occur, and a lot of me, third parties that can come in and develop to solve the B2B use cases. So that includes, hey, we gotta make sure we continue to be interoperable, accessible, extensible, and provide the open source innovation. That's kind of a high level expectation on what we are going to be embarking on a journey here very soon. 1 to 2 years, I think, out, this landscape will dramatically change. And I'm going to pass over to Jin to give you some of the snapshot on how the networks are going to help us get to that point.
Awesome. Thank you, and good morning to everybody. So I'm the executive director of Commonwealth Health Alliance. I'm going to give you guys actually 3 things, really. I'm going to give you a quick refresher on what Commonwealth is. For those of you who are very green, hopefully you'll sort of kind of get it by the time I'm done. And for those of you who've been following us since our inception 5 years ago, you'll get a little bit of an update of where we are. Then I'm actually going to spend a little bit more time talking about TEFCA. TEFCA is kind of painting the world for us, looking beyond the current year into the years ahead. And I'm going to spend a couple of moments on that, a little bit more than a couple of moments on that, and then I'm going to kind of bring those 2 things together and tell you how Commonwealth is embracing TEFCA and where we think the future for Commonwealth is going, and with respect to both its own members as well as to the wider community and how we're connecting everybody up together. So first, let's start with a refresher. Commonwealth, as you probably know, is a not-for-profit, an independent trade association open to all organizations who believe in our vision and mission. To the extent that we are open, you can see that we have a broad swath of the membership of the industry. We started off with EHR vendors primarily as our initial founders, and have gradually expanded, and now more than 20 different care settings are represented by our 80 and growing members across the entire care continuum. Not just technology vendors, although they are still kind of the big drivers of the lines, but also provider organizations, government agencies, state HIEs, other complementary types of initiatives, and we continue to just grow across this spectrum as we know that this notion, this vision that health data should be available to individuals and providers at the point of care, regardless of where care has occurred. That's already the fundamental vision that Commonwealth is founded on, and that access to that data should just be built into whatever it is the caregiver uses to take care of that individual. To accomplish that, our mission has been to build vendor-neutral platform that allows us to break down those barriers of interoperability between care settings and care locations across the U.S. And what that platform looks like is really it's a centralized set of services that really put the person at the center of exchange. It's an EMPI and an RLS and what we call a query broker that allows you to do things like enroll patients, create unique identifiers for them nationally, find their records across the entire network wherever they had gone to care, regardless of whatever EHR system they were connected to, match and link their records, because we know there's not an actual, there's a lot of opportunity for errors in matching patients' data, and there's no national patient identifier that everybody kind of carries and walks around with. And then actually go and get that data, query for the data, and pull it in that same set of transactions without having to build point-to-point interfaces nationwide, which is an absolutely unscalable problem. So that's what we've created here. Funny thing is we don't actually store any of the clinical data, and this is the point I always make. We don't store any of the clinical data. We're not a big sort of cloud of data in the sky. We're a little bit more like a router in the sky. We'll go find that data in real time for you, bring it back so that as you're taking care of the patient, or if you're the patient, you want your own data, we can go bring that back to you and deliver it to you so you can utilize it. And it's not theory, right? We're live. We're very much live. We're live at more than 8,000 locations across the country. We have more than 25 million patients already currently enrolled. We call them persons because it kind of represents how they presented at patients at several different places. And we're growing at about 1 million persons a month. And we have more than 80 million records available for those individuals today across the country so far. So very much a live network. And we're still thinking about, well, how do we expand the network within our membership? How do we expand the network in terms of our deployments? And also, how do we work with others so that really wherever that patient goes, we can get their data, and it's not a matter of they're on X EHR who happens to be in Commonwealth or not. And that's where we have partnered with our friends at Care Equality. Very different type of organization, but also with a very sort of similar mission. And together, between Commonwealth and Care Equality, our members account for 90% of the install base in the acute care market and more than 60% of the ambulatory market. And we're working with them in a few different dimensions to enable interoperability between the both organizations. So we are implementing sort of their base standard or requirement on in their framework, which is called directed query. I know where a patient is. I want to ask that location for that patient and get back their record. We are very RLS based, so you kind of don't even need to know in the first place where the patient has been. We'll tell you where they've been and then give you the records. And we're working on a way to actually get our set of innovations to fit into what Care Equality has kind of designed as their sort of optional add-ons to their base service. And then we're working with their parent organization, the Sequoia Project, on a number of different initiatives. Right now we have actually an initiative going on with them where some of their largest members are getting together to improve the quality and the consistency of the CCDA document, which is the primary form of exchange today in terms of sharing clinical data. And together, those organizations have an opportunity to really shift the quality of interoperability nationwide. So we're working with them. In this world of directed query with which we're working with them today, we have, as many of you probably know, we announced that we are going to start working with them and actually get interoperability going this year, and we're well on track. We're completed with design and development and integration testing, so we know that the network and that framework can connect. We have pilots starting imminently, sometime this spring, hopefully very soon. And we expect to have that availability, generally available by this summer, which means that by the summer, regardless of whether you're an implementer in the Care Equality framework world or you are a subscribing member that's connected to the Commonwealth network, you'll be able to exchange data between each other. And that's going to be super exciting because, again, between the two organizations, it's a very large part of all of healthcare. It's not all of healthcare, and we're going to continue working with other organizations as well to continue ensuring that we can get 100% patient coverage, but it is a pretty large percentage. That's kind of the here and now. That's what's happening this year. And obviously it'll pay dividends over the next year or two and beyond. But if you kind of look at the sort of the longer picture, we're living in what we call the TEFCA world, or what will be the TEFCA world. Everybody here know what TEFCA is? Put your hand up if you kind of know what TEFCA is. Now, I'm seeing some, all right, I see some hands up. I also see some people like, nope, don't know that, and blasted, is that yet another acronym I have to be familiar with? Unfortunately, probably yes. So TEFCA stands for the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement. It is a repercussion of the 21st Century Cures Act. Believe it or not, it was a heavily bipartisan act that came out at the end of 2016. And it requires, well, I'll tell you what it requires in a moment. Its goals were really to enable nationwide interoperability, to create sort of a scalable opportunity for participants, providers, patients, and other participants in the healthcare continuum to be able to share data. The one thing that kind of stands out specifically to me, so this is my overlay on these are very official bullet points which we gleaned straight from sort of ONC's website, is that this notion of a single on-ramp. If I am a provider today, do I connect to Commonwealth? Do I connect to Care Equality? Do I connect to my local HIE? Do I connect to my state HIE? Do I connect to something else? Do I have to connect to all? Trying to figure that out was actually sort of a big part of what TEFCA was trying to accomplish, so that you don't have to make that decision. You connect to whichever one of these makes the most sense, because each one of them is going to be a little different, but you connect to whichever one makes the most sense for your situation, and you get access to the others without having to build a connection to each. And that's really what, in our minds, they're really trying to do, and you'll hear ONC speak about this time and time again as an overarching goal, this what they call a single on-ramp into nationwide interoperability. We think, by the way, that that's a great idea. Let me tell you how it's structured. I will spend a moment on this slide. So if I had to kind of, thankfully this is more or less reproduced from ONC's website. So TEFCA introduces this notion that we need a backbone of health information exchange that is not super different from, if you think of the backbone of the internet today, it's actually a handful of ISPs out there that really enable connectivity. We need the equivalent there, where we have these organizations, what they call qualified health information networks with very specific requirements. If these become the bodies that connect to each other, we can form a backbone, and everybody else can connect to whatever part of that backbone makes sense to them. So they introduced this notion of the QHIN, and that the QHINs would connect to each other through sort of a componentry that they call the connectivity broker, which looks not very different from what Commonwealth calls its query broker. Some differences, but not a whole lot. But if you have these various bodies working together, how do you make sure you have the right set of rules of the road? How do you make sure that there actually is sort of a common agreement that everybody agrees to, so that we know that we can actually connect to each other and we're not violating each other's terms? And that's where they came up with the notion of a recognized coordinating entity, yet another acronym, RCE. And the idea is that RCE would consist of the kind of representation from the private sector, along with, and really the other participants in the public sector, along with ONC's direct engagement, in order to provide the right set of rules of the road and enable scalable interoperability nationwide. Each QHIN, in the meantime, looking sort of a layer down, will have its own set of participants. They'll have their own set of end-using organizations. Those end-using organizations will have their own type of participants, end users, individuals, human beings who utilize their services, and so each individual at the very bottom of the tree will be able to connect to everybody else inside this framework. And then, because there's a common agreement set by ONC in collaboration with the RCE, that set of flow downs in terms of requirements, privacy and security and authentication, or et cetera, requirements will flow down to everybody, and even down to the end user, so that we know that we have essentially created what? A trust fabric. You've created a trust fabric for nationwide query and retrieve. So that's sort of the outline of what TEFCA aimed to do, and sort of Commonwealth's role, given what I just shared with you, is relatively straightforward. Commonwealth will becomes a QHIN in this kind of in this sort of framework. We've already actually outwardly declared that we intend to be a QHIN, so it's in some ways it's a revelation, in some ways it's not. And in this world, so the way it would work for those of you who utilize Cerner or one of our member EHRs, eClinicalWorks, Athena, and so on, Commonwealth becomes a QHIN. Our members and participants are typically the EHR vendors, although we are seeing a number of other types of entities connecting to us too. So, for example, we have HIEs who are actually connecting to us as our members. And their end users could be physicians, clinicians, nurses, social health workers, other folks who connect into Commonwealth and now depend on Commonwealth through their connection through their EHR vendor or whoever their vendor is into the broader ecosystem of query and exchange. So it becomes a very scalable model from the perspective of the one individual who's trying to get data for the patient across the nation. And Of course, being in that model down there, even though we fit very sort of infrastructure-wise, technology-wise, we fit very elegantly as a QHIN, since we are likely, and I mean, maybe not quote me on this, although I'll say it in a pretty public forum, we're likely to be one of the broadest, maybe possibly the biggest, but certainly one of the broadest QHINs out there. And so we'd expect to have a fundamental role in shaping what that RCE looks like. And kind of helping to set the rules of the road, which we know we have the collective intelligence of a huge community of these 80 and increasing members to help us share where it is that we should go as a nation. Just to kind of zoom out for a second, the TEFCA timeline, for those of you who are just not familiar with it, TEFCA is, a draft rule just came out. We've gotten a fair bit of guidance from that draft rule. They are going to be selecting an RCE in, at least that what they've shared is that it's sometime this summer, with an indication that they'll have the final rule out by the end of the year. I always give a little bit of, fudge factor to any sort of set of timelines you get from the government, but, this is a fair articulation of where they think we're going to go in terms of timeline. And then there'll be a little bit of an implementation period before you see that reality of TEFCA come to life. And my guess would be somewhere on, order of 12 to 24 months after the end of this year. So we're really talking about 2 to 3 years from now what the world is really going to look like and what we're all kind of moving towards. And so now if you kind of pull this back, and say, well, what did we think about TEFCA? I think I've shared most of it with you, so I'll just kind of sprint through this. First of all, we're very supportive of the notion of TEFCA. The idea that me as a clinician or a patient myself or a social worker, I can find out where the patient is, get their data because I need to take care of them, and there may be critical data out there that I need. And there are no blind spots because everybody is connected through an RLS mechanism and a query broker. That is super powerful. Then I know I really can get the patient's data no matter whether they're taken care of and ultimately connected to some HIE over there or some EHR over there or some connectivity framework over there. We know we'll be able to get the data. And our only hope is actually that it becomes an actual thing because TEFCA, by the way it was written by Congress, was actually voluntary. And we hope that there's actually more teeth put into the voluntary regulation through things like the data blocking rule that's going to come out shortly. The second thing we said, and I just said it right now, is we intend to be a QHIN. The TEFCA ruling was certainly far from perfect. There are a lot of operational concerns that have to be addressed there. But assuming reasonable resolution of those concerns, we expect to be a QHIN. We expect to be enabling these sets of this type of interoperability nationwide. And thirdly, that RCE, if you think about what we have today, the great organizations across the healthcare spectrum today and interoperability, none of them really fits the RCE bill perfectly, right? If you want a coordinating entity, you want them to have representation from the QHINs, and we don't even know who the QHINs are. Except, Commonwealth said it, but, there's bound to be a few more, or hopefully be a few more. And you also want representation from a good cross-section of society, large health systems, small health systems, the patients, payers probably. You'd probably want the right set of stakeholders that's actually representative of the community and not just one particular set of initiatives that any one organization's formed. So we don't think anybody is there yet to be an RC, but there are a lot of organizations who have done good work, and Commonwealth will help shape what the RCE looks like. At least that's our hope. Whether it's a brand new body or an existing body that kind of just creates the right sort of structure in order to be so representative. And so if you think about kind of putting those two things together, what Commonwealth is and where TEFCA is going, you can see that Commonwealth, when we started, when we launched the service itself 3 years ago, it was all EHRs. It's still the majority of what we're doing, and it is still my number one priority to drive EHR adoption and end user adoption from those EHRs. Over time, we have added patient portals. We have added post-acute settings. In fact, I'll do a little bit of a shameless plug. We have our Interop Showcase Nationwide Care Transitions booth right over there, where you'll see how in the home health setting, a very underserved setting from the point of view of interoperability, and in the patient portal setting, along with a couple of the ambulatory and acute settings, how you can actually be able to figure out where the patient's data has been, no matter which of those settings you're in and no matter which technology system they use. And so we have that live and kicking today, and we see a lot of adoption of that over the next couple of years. We've also, like I said, we've started connecting to these other organizations, Carry Quality, HIEs, others. There are a number of proprietary networks who are actually doing really good work as well, and we're getting them to connect to our standards-based, vendor-neutral platform so that they can also share data in both directions with the greater community. And as TEFCA takes hold, what we see is sort of more like a gentle evolution of what we have already. We'll have some organizations who, let's say an HIE who says, wow, that whole bundle of stuff I need to do for TEFCA is just a lot of work. We're going to work with Commonwealth to enable it, even while Commonwealth continues building its stack of various capabilities as we get into FHIR, as we get into the ability to not just query retrieve, but also notify. And all of that jazz, we'll work with Commonwealth to do it. And there are others who will actually try to become QHIMSS themselves, and we'll work with them too. As we would have already, but now in the context of TEFCA. And so Commonwealth really does become a single place where you can go and get the data for that patient where they've gone. So I just blasted through a whole lot of slides. Hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully it kind of got the message across as to what we're doing, where we're going. I'm going to pass it back to David because as much as I can talk all day about this stuff, it's a piece of a larger set of things that happen in interoperability. David, can you take it up? Thank you.
Thank you, Jitin. Can you hear me okay? Good. As Jitin said, I'm David McCauley. I'm a Senior Vice President at Cerner. I've been at Cerner for 27 years, the last 10 of which have focused a lot on interoperability. And what I want to do is take a little bit more of a zoomed out view, repeat a little bit of what Jitin covered so efficiently, but zoom out a little bit. So Kashif started with Cerner's specific views. Jitin zoomed out to Commonwealth, which is a multi-vendor alliance. I'm going to come and try to give you a view from way up in the sky, what else is going along, what else is happening in interoperability, and how might our landscape change in the future. So I think the first and most important new thing that's going on is that we've really entered into the API era. API is an application programming interface. I assume most of you are knowledgeable about what that means. If you had the opportunity to listen to Seema Verma's presentation on Tuesday, she made a very robust endorsement of the belief that the current administration, through its rulemaking authorities and leveraging the 21st Century Cures Act, is going to push out API requirements across the industry. And it's really quite surprising if you look at this graph here to see how fast we've gone from sort of a suggestion that came in the form of the Jason report, which was in 2014, that the industry should adopt standards-based APIs, all the way to a bipartisan binding bit of legislation called the 21st Century Cures Act that's going to actually make that a reality. Now the details of how that plays out is going to be complicated, and will take a lot of time to figure out how to do it well, but this has happened. We're not changing back. And that will, in the long run, really change how we think about interoperability. One step in that direction is smart apps and FHIR. Smart on FHIR is a way to allow a third party to create a user experience and push it into a workflow of an EHR or other healthcare delivery application, so that you can now have not only sharing of data, but you can actually share interactions. You can actually, in a sense, converse with the end user. This is based on APIs being exposed by the vendors. And then third-party app developers using those APIs to build these apps that can plug in. This was first introduced about 4 years ago at HIMSS, and it's now, you can walk the show floor and see quite a few vendors and quite a few apps that are running across vendors. So proof is there that this idea actually works, and I think it's going to only grow. Now, if you can plug an app in, but your end user doesn't know the app is there, you haven't really solved the problem. So the next thing coming that you should put on your radar to watch, if you're interested in following what's happening with this API transition, is something called CDS hooks. And I don't have time to go into how CDS hooks works. There will be a detailed presentation tomorrow around noon at the HL7 booth that Josh Mandel and I will give, where we dive into what does all this mean. But suffice it to say that CDS hooks is a tool that will allow knowledge vendors to leverage their capabilities in the workflow of the EHR. So the EHR will know when it's time to tell you something, including launch a smart app if they need to actually interact with you. So CDS hooks is going to be an important part of expanding the role of interoperability around knowledge resources, content, advice giving, pharmacogenomics. Those are all of the kinds of things that CDS HOOKS standards are going to enable. Cerner's a major support for them. Let me show you a little cartoon diagram here of how some of this might work. Imagine that you have a population health service that a group of providers in a community have agreed to work with in the context of an ACO or some other kind of shared risk setting. How can they coordinate a care plan across the different vendors? Well, one way is to send static documents that represent the care plans back and forth between the vendors. That's not going to be very satisfying to the clinicians because care plans for patients are always changing. We think a better way to do that will be to push smart apps out to those vendors' EHRs and then coordinate the care plan with an interaction amongst the smart app users. So you could have an Epic user and a Cerner user and an Athena user all managing a care plan with their input depending upon what role they're playing in the care and the overall care process. This is the next generation of interoperability. Now you see across the bottom there I've got a data bus that's Commonwealth and then eventually something that comes from TEFCA. So none of that goes away. The ability to move the data around is still critical to this long-range vision, but we have to go to the next step of pushing interoperable interactivity into the workflow. I'm getting a sign that maybe my mic is not as close to my mouth. Hopefully that you can hear me. So this is where we're headed. Now, what's it look like today and what do we think is going to happen in the next couple of years? I'm going to repeat a little bit of what Jitin said, but I'm going to do it with a different organization, a different way of approaching it. So apologies if this is redundant, but hopefully it's complicated enough that it doesn't hurt to hear it twice. So one way to look at interoperability and what's going on is to sort of do a grid where you analyze the functionality of a particular interoperable service on one axis and then the geographic reach on the other. So you can see across the bottom we've got local, regional, and national. So there are local interoperable schemes, regional and national. And then on the y-axis, going up and down, we have simple capabilities, basically data pipes, moving information from one place to another but not processing it. Intermediate capabilities like a clinical data repository that builds and deduplicates an aggregated record. And then advanced clinical services at the top where you might have something like a population health service. So in this sort of grid, how do we describe the current landscape? So, and again, this is one way of looking at it. It's a complicated space. You could probably drive 5 or 6 other dimensions on here and still make sense out of it, but I'm going to limit it to 2 dimensions. One thing is that we all live and operate heavily in local plumbing. There's a lot of ADT movement, a lot of HL7V2 activity that synchronizes labs across tests, orders across systems in an integrated delivery network. All of that is really important. It's not sexy anymore. It's not going to go away anytime soon. That's going to be kind of the foundation of interoperability. But what we've seen emerge on top of that initially were vendor networks and what I will call state and regional networks that were essentially either moving data back and forth or in some cases with some of the HIEs actually building aggregates of the data. So they're moving up the vertical axis as well as providing sort of regional connectivity. So this is kind of the state of the world before Commonwealth emerged. The first thing at the national scale was Direct, which is a secure email capability, not well used yet, but we think it's going to catch on as vendors do a better job of integrating it into the workflow. And then something like Commonwealth and other national scale health information arrangements like Care Quality that Jitin discussed. So what Commonwealth represents is a national approach because it covers everybody, but it's fairly simple. It's moving data around. It's not trying to do value-add services like population health. So into this space, since these value-add services like population health are increasingly critical in a risk-sharing environment, you've seen another kind of interoperable solution emerge, which is in a sense what we used to call the private HIEs. I think nobody really likes that term. It maybe sounds a little bit pejorative, but fundamentally it's an aggregation of data on behalf of a group of providers who are in fact competing in the market. So the data that is not as broadly shared, but it's deeper data for that particular use case, such as an ACO. So this is kind of the state of the world today. Oh, and then I'll mention that there are a couple of other national scale services like e-prescribing. They are very purpose specific. I'm not going to say a whole lot more about them, but acknowledge that they exist and they're not going to go away in the future. So if this is a pretty accurate description of today's story. Now, Jitin told you about TEFCA. And he did such a nice job of defining it, I'm not going to waste any time on repeating that definition. But TEFCA will create, in a sense, a network that weaves these other networks together. How might this play out? So here's one scenario. One thing is, as Jitin said, Commonwealth is likely to become a QHIN. So Commonwealth already performs many of the capabilities that are required of a QHIN, and it's a logical thing to believe that Commonwealth will, in fact, nominate itself to become a QHIN and operate under TEFCA. When that happens, we expect other entities that are now sort of, in a sense, want to be a part of TEFCA but don't want to be a QHIN themselves to join QHINs like Commonwealth. So some of the state and regional HIEs will join Commonwealth, we predict, and become a participant where Commonwealth represents their exposure to the broad TEFCA network and then manages them as a participant in that slide that Jitin showed you. But ONC wants a competitive market for QHINs, so we expect that there will be other QHINs that will emerge. We don't know who they're going to be, but I'm pretty sure there will be more than a few. And some of the state and regional HIEs will join these new QHINs. So we expect maybe in a couple of years to see a world where there's a new layer, this QHIN layer, that coordinates interchange amongst the regional and vendor-specific networks that are underneath. Now, the big question that's an unknown is what happens to the vendor networks, because a number of the large-scale vendors have pretty good networks that work well within their own population, and what happens to these, in a sense, private HIEs? And I think the answer is we don't have a clue. It's possible that they will join QHINs. It's possible that they might even become a QHIN, depending upon how the final rules emerge from ONC. So this diagram is messy because we're entering into a fairly messy era where a lot of debate's going to happen. You'll see a lot of movement, and then over time it'll settle out. Now, let's say that's all working. What new problems does that create for us? Other than the problem of figuring out what's the best solution to that problem of all those connecting errors with question marks on them, one problem is that we're going to go from this sort of ironic state of not having enough data to having too much data. If we reach the point where a provider has access to the complete record of a patient every time they want it, that's a lot of data that they currently don't see. And so one way to look at sort of the expansion of the data types is to say there's kind of the state of the art today is that an EHR, a provider with an active EHR has a set of data that they're comfortable with because it's in their EHR. They either put it there or their colleagues did. They are now beginning to integrate data coming in from an ACO, which is a broader range of data. It's not the complete record, but it's broader than what they had. And then on top of that, we'll have something that you just could call outside data or external data that will come in as a function of services like Commonwealth in the near term and the TEFCA relationships in the long run. So what are we going to do with all this data? So here are some of the challenges, and I'm going to pose them as challenges because I don't believe as a community that we've solved them yet. So one of the challenges is how much can we automate the reconciliation of this data? It's not a hard problem to reconcile something like a lab result because it has a date and a time and a range, and you can easily, a value and a range of normal. It's pretty easy to determine that you've seen it before or you haven't seen it before. But what do you do about allergies or problems where two providers have a different definition of what's wrong with the patient? One might think it's a tension headache, one thinks it's a migraine, one wants to rule out a brain tumor. They could all be accurately describing their view of the patient. How do you reconcile that into a common view? And then what about something like a care plan? As I mentioned, that's a much more of an interactive opportunity, and I think it's not going to be simple to do a reconciliation. One of the reasons that this is hard is we don't have provenance of data, and those of you who are geeks for ONC activity, one of the things that came out along with the TEFCA proposal was something called the U.S. Core Data Initiative, USCDI, and in there is a proposal to start adding provenance to the data that we exchange so that we can see if we know where it comes from, we have a better job of figuring out whether it's something we've seen or not. Now, provenance is really hard. The vendors are going to have a lot of work to do that. So this will be an area for active debate by the vendor community on what's the right level of provenance to track and how to fit it into current systems. That's going to be a big play in the next year. And then, given that we have limited time and attention of the provider, what new services do the vendor communities have to develop to make this data easy to assimilate? So I really want something that will show me what's new, show me what I need to know. Maybe there's a whole bunch of data going on that I don't need to know about because it's not relevant to the care I'm giving. And if I do need to find something, it's out there somewhere, let me find it. Give me the tools to search for it and find it quickly. So I think we have a good number of minutes here for questions. I'm going to stop with that point and say thank you for listening, and you guys ready for some questions?
Yeah.
So we would love to have some questions. I don't know what the process is. Here's the mic over there that we can get to you. I know we ran through a lot of material. I wanted to tee up a lot of interesting topics, so please fire away on any one of us, any topic. In the green shirt, you've got the mic.
Hi, I have the control.
Hey, you have control.
So I just wanted to understand more about the smart app that you listed. And you have it on different platforms like Cerner and some others. So is that only for the APIs, or is that including any user interface in the smart app in what you're proposing?
The question was about smart apps and whether it involves just APIs or user interface. So we could go deep on Smart and Fire. Fire is the API definition that the vendors have adopted, and that's an HL7 standard that's emerging. The Argonaut project is a group of vendors who've agreed to work on specific subsets of Fire to make sure that we're consistent in how we implement them. What Smart does is put the app capability on top of Fire. So I don't know if it's worth going back to, here's a, so the Fire part allows the app to talk to local data in your EHR. The Smart part allows a remote service to push a user conversation with, including a user experience, a user interface, into the workflow. Drop by one of the participating vendors, which would be Epic, Cerner, Athena, there's I'm sure some others, and you can get a demo of Smart apps and see what they look like. And if you go from one vendor to the next vendor, you'll see the same app running, even though it's in a different vendor's setting. So it actually works. Next question, where are we? I don't know how we do this. I'll shift to this side of the room. How about gentleman here right behind? Yeah, you there in the dark shirt.
What's the opinion or stance on auto-enrollment of patients? Is it different by vendor? Do patients get we're just kind of on the beginning journey of Commonwealth.
Yeah.
We've got Evident, who's a Commonwealth partner in the hospital, Athena in the clinics, and I kind of think two different vendors enroll differently. But what's the general stance on how involved do you ask your patients at registration about enrolling them in Commonwealth?
Yeah, great question about a really important issue in the workflow of getting patients to join these national networks, which is the opt-in versus opt-out decision. Jiten, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I'll take
enrollment question?
Sure, I'll take a start at it. So the way we have thought about it is what we want to do first and foremost is make sure that we're copacetic with laws, right? Obviously, starting with HIPAA, going down to state and local laws, and then actually the policies of the organization itself. And the approach we took when we first launched was that it would be a manual opt-in based process because we just, that's the most conservative thing you can do. And what we realized, of course, no duh, sort of in retrospect, is that you just didn't get enough people clicking and actually opting the patient. So we went to, what we decided to do was we went to this place where we left it upon the practice and the EHR serving that practice to decide what would be appropriate for meeting the laws in their neighborhood. And what we find out is that in opt-out types of states, an auto enrollment process where the patients automatically opt in tends to work. So from the Commonwealth perspective, it is, we defer sort of the enrollment appropriateness up to the end practice. So we've enabled things like auto enroll where that makes sense, manual enroll where that makes sense. And it really is up to the practice and then their work with the EHR vendor to get it done. So it's not dictated by the EHR or by Commonwealth per se. And of course, given that we're in a continuous journey, some EHRs get to implementing our latest innovations, later on as we continuously kind of improve the services. Does that help? Does it make sense?
Well, let me shift to the other side. The gentleman here in the front row.
So, where does
I'm sorry.
you can hear me.
Yeah, I'll repeat his question.
Where this especially this relates to all of you, but especially to the VA, DOD, and community providers project that you identified. Where does the social component of information in the profile of the patient fit in, especially with the veterans. We know that that's such a critical ingredient.
Yeah.
But going towards the future of population health and
Yeah.
all of the other ingredients, how do you all see that fitting into that?
You mean like social determinants of health when you say the social component?
Yes, of course, but eventually beyond that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
you wanna repeat
Is it more? Yeah. So the question was, especially in the federal space, the Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs, when they come alive in the community care, how do these social elements play out? I'm assuming one is consumer, right? Like how does as a veteran, I or you, somebody, how do I interact? So a part of that,
Things like this is the big move towards caregivers, utilizing caregivers.
yes. So caregivers, care plans, SNFs. I think it's a broad question about the community involvement altogether. The seamless care with the community, the vision from my VA friends has been that is the core component of when they talk about it's way beyond acute and ambulatory. The patient's engagement, the care managers, hospices, long-term care, actually really the full continuum of suite is the under the umbrella of seamless care with the community. So that is the day one thing to go start to address a lot of those things. And how do we bring the consumers or the patients itself a part of that process to making sure that the patients are in the center? Because if we don't have their engagement, involvement, then I think we're missing the point. So absolutely, anybody from the VA would like to add, they're welcome to do it, but it is encompassing all of that. There's social determinants, and one example I'll give you is suicide risks, right? I mean, a lot of the veterans population may be suffering with PTSD, and there are other things and deterrents that basically impact them. So the idea is to be able to forewarn, look at the patterns and behaviors. If somebody's missing their dosage on medications, or somebody's got sort of veered from the care plan, how do we give appropriate alerts and notifications to forewarn the wife, the spouse, the care plan manager, or a clinician to say, hey, you gotta pay attention, because it could be possible that this person's now starting to just give up, and it's our job as a community to make sure we can bring them back into the plan. So the interventions are important, and that's a big part of the equation that will be in a part of the implementations.
Who has the microphone? You, sir, green jacket.
Can you talk a little bit about the structure of QHINs, because they seem like a natural evolution of HIEs? So in light of some of the challenges HIEs have had, how will QHINs be structured or operate differently in order to learn from that?
So the question is about the structure of the QHINs. There's a lot that's not yet settled, because what we've got from ONC is a draft document. They got a lot of feedback, several hundred detailed documents of feedback from the vendors and other players in the community, suggesting different ways of thinking about the QHIN. So we don't honestly know exactly where it'll land, but I think the broad framework is a belief that the QHIN represents the ability for a given stakeholder, a given holder of patient information to be able to share that data with the outside world. And the requirement would be that QHIN must share the data in response to a query from the outside world. So whether that's done in a Commonwealth fashion with a record locator that sits above a bunch of vendors, or whether vendors are allowed in the long run to become their own QHIN, which is not in the current draft, but is something that's been proposed to ONC, it's unclear, but the obligation of the QHIN is to say if you get a query about a patient, then you must respond to it with all the data that you have about that patient, all the data that you're allowed to share, et cetera. Now, the QHINs will obviously want to work together and with the RCE to figure out an architecturally efficient way to do that. If everybody has to blast every query every time to every other QHIN, the lights around the country will dim for all the processing overhead that would create. So we envision that the RCE, and what we propose to ONC is let the RCE work with the actual QHINs and figure out an efficient way to make that work. it'll be some form of a record locator service and some form of ADT data sharing, so you know where the patient data lives. But the details are not, we don't know yet.
Right.
We have a couple of more questions. Let's go back to this side. Who gets the microphone gets to ask the question. I'm going to let our assistants mediate that.
I really appreciate you bringing up the issue of too much data. I still practice, and I can tell you that if I get a carefully curated one-page letter from a referring physician, that's very helpful. If I get 500 pages of Xerox medical record from another physician, that's not only impenetrable and useless, but it's less than useless. It creates risk.
Yeah.
If there's a factoid on page 232 that I missed, and as a result I create harm, I am liable for that. It was on my desk. And I can only tell you that electronic health records have exacerbated that problem, because now we have note bloat,
Right.
and we have a diminishing signal-to-noise ratio in the records that I get. And until we figure out some way of allowing the filtering process that you showed a few minutes ago to take hold, so that the data that is dumped on the practicing physician is accessible and useful, this is not going to work.
Yep. So a terrific comment from somebody who lives the pain of too much data and data that's not well organized for quick access. So I totally agree, and we've got a massive effort underway at Cerner to try to improve that situation. But the most important thing actually was the second thing that Administrator Verma said in her presentations yesterday, or Tuesday. But that was yesterday, wasn't it? It's HIMSS, I don't know which day it is. And that is that they are willing at CMS to rethink the E&M process that determines how much you have to document to achieve a certain level of reimbursement. The reason we have note bloat is because the rules that were written in the mid-90s are really inappropriate for the electronic medical record era. So it's so easy to upscale your note by pushing a button that brings in a macro template of all this data that now pollutes the note. Every note has all of that data in it every time, and it essentially so much noise, there's no signal anymore. So the most important thing will be if CMS carries through on that and relaxes some of the requirements that create note bloat in the first place. If they do that, the notes should become much more concise and much more relevant to what's important in the information, what you need to know. Now, on top of that, however, is a great opportunity for machine learning and AI. And it's a project that my research team at Cerner specifically is working on, where we're analyzing millions of patient records to see what data the clinicians actually touch for a given condition, so that if you have a patient with that condition and there's a whole bunch of data out there, we can go out and look for that specific subset of the data and bring it to your attention. So we can use machine learning to figure out what you're likely to be interested in. Now, we won't be perfect. You're still on the hook for making the decisions, but we think there's ways to use tools like AI to improve that experience. But let's fix those E&M codes first. That would make things much better. I think we're out of time. So, hey, thanks for all the great questions and the attention. We'll hang around for a few minutes afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.